Following an investigation costing $4 million, it was concluded that the start of the fire could not be conclusively tied down to a specific ignition source. Using the evidence at hand, the investigation panel theorized that a spark from a wire with damaged insulation had been the cause of the fire. Here, Grissom can be seen inside the spacecraft with a bundle of wires below his feet. This is a photo of the left-hand side of the spacecraft in the area in which the fire is alleged to have started. The narrative spun around the fire, for whatever reason, often states that the crew succumbed to the toxic atmosphere inside the cockpit within seconds, and that any burns were inflicted following their deaths. In other words, they did not suffer.
Apparently, from the early evidence from the capsule, it went, and it went fast. These men were breathing pure oxygen. They, in a sense, were part of this immediate, momentary, by the second disaster, millisecond disaster. And if there is anything that can be rationalized about their deaths, it undoubtedly was instantaneous.
The truth is that the stage with the highest intensity of the fire came before the stage where toxic fumes began, so the crew were alive and conscious for the duration of the fire. All three men had suffered third-degree burns. Mike Collins puts it bluntly in his book, Carrying the Fire, when he talks about having to inform Martha Chaffee about the fire. I hadn't expected Apollo to mean this. Risk, certainly, but not the trauma of telling beautiful women that their husbands had fried. Christopher Kraft, Director of Flight Operations at MSC, noted that, "I heard them scream that they were on fire. I heard them scream, 'Get me out of here.' And then there was dead silence on the pad." The A1 suits and helmets that the crew were wearing offered fire resistance and thermal protection up to a point, but that point was exceeded during a post-fire test inside a chamber containing an atmosphere of 95% oxygen at 16.5 psi. A strip of Nomex caught fire at the point of ignition and burnt through within seconds. And the photographs of the crew's spacesuits bear witness to this. Grissom's spacesuit is extensively damaged. White's spacesuit shows the difficulty he would have had turning the handle due to the damage to his gloves. Chaffee's spacesuit bears witness to the fact that he was on the opposite side of the fire to the ignition point and spent the least amount of time in direct contact with the fire. All three spacesuit visors have been deformed due to heat damage, and some damage to the suits was probably caused during the removal from the spacecraft. Richard S. Johnston, the chief of the Crew Systems Division, recalled, "I went out and looked at those suits, and it was one of the most horrible things I ever had to do in my life. Those guys really suffered. It was bad." It was determined that three factors added to the deaths of the crew: the spacecraft's hatch, the high internal pressure, and the use of a pure oxygen atmosphere. The hatch design for the Block 1 was a plug type hatch. It was not on hinges, and it did not open outwards. Instead, when it was being installed, it had to be passed through the hatchway and then manoeuvred into place. It was pushed back against the hatch sill and then secured in place with 6 latches along its bottom edge. The latches were opened and closed by inserting a handle into the lock and turning it. The time required to open up this hatch is usually quoted at about 1.5 minutes, but it is important to remember that even before they could unplug the inner hatch from its seal, the internal atmosphere had to be equalised to that of the outside. An internal pressure of 16.7 psi was required inside the cockpit, because, as Stephen Clemens told me, the spacecraft was not leak-proof. The reason they pressurised to about 1 pound over sea level, which is 14.7 psi, was to prevent atmosphere pressure from seeping into the craft during this test, since they were monitoring suit and cabin pressure. In regards to the hazards of operating with oxygen, an incident on the 25th of March 1970 illustrates just how dangerous it can be. On that date, liquid oxygen was being used to cool down a transfer pump involved in the transfer of liquid oxygen to the Apollo 13 Saturn V for the countdown demonstration test. Normally, the liquid oxygen used in the chilling process blew away after being released, but on this occasion it gathered in a ditch. Several security cars driving past caught fire and burnt furiously when their engines came into contact with the vapours being given off from the liquid oxygen in the ditch. There were other factors playing out, one of them being the pressure to launch, something Shearer would call go fever. President Johnson was one of those applying pressure. He was mired in a war that was making headlines for all the wrong reasons, and he wanted something else to answer questions about other than the growing number of bodies returning home. Unfortunately for the president, the first manned Apollo flight would just give him more funerals to attend. Grissom's wife, Betty, blamed President Johnson for his part in pushing the schedule so hard, and at her husband's funeral she could hardly stand to look at the president, quickly brushing off his platitudes. It is ironic that the contractors, North American, would take so much of the blame, given the fact that the conditions under which the test took place were outside of those that they recommended. NASA had, it seemed, become complacent about working with oxygen environments. The report produced by the Apollo 204 Review Board declared, "Those organisations responsible for the planning, conduct and safety of this test failed to identify it as being hazardous. Contingency preparations to permit escape or rescue of the crew from an internal command module fire were not made." North American had also suggested floor panels and a two-gas system of nitrogen and oxygen instead of pure oxygen, both of which were rejected by NASA. As well as this, North American had also asked for stricter control of flammable objects inside the cockpit. Crucially, North American proposed an outward opening hatch that could be opened in seconds. They were not the only ones who saw this as a preferable option. According to Isley in the book Apollo Pilot, some of the astronauts had asked Joe Shea, head of the Apollo Spacecraft Program Office, about having an hatch that was easy to open and opened outwards, but he simply replied, "Too much money and not enough time." Following the fire, NASA would find plenty of both. The post-fire history is well known. NASA dropped the Block 1 spacecraft from their manned program and incorporated everything they learned into making the Block 2 spacecraft fit for purpose. The fire is a painful memory, but it is history that cannot be forgotten. Neither should the ordeal that the crew went through be toned down because it diminishes the sacrifice they made. The fire ultimately led man all the way to the moon and allowed giant leaps to be made. Their sacrifice was not in vain.